Well, it's not Halloween yet for another 3 weeks or so, but it is October, and I felt like the Halloween setup was appropriate for this one. Why the heck not? Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about album number 10 from Biosphere, Departed Glories. So, okay, 10th album, it's 2016, 4 years after the bizarre misstep that was his previous album. And yet again, we got a pretty interesting concept here, one that feels a bit more in line with the kind of stuff you'd expect out of Biosphere than last time, but still enough of its own thing that you're not gonna, mistake this album for one of his other ones. So here's what I've read when it comes to the concept of Departed Glories. While working on this album, Jansen had been living in the Wolski forest in Poland, or however you say Wolski, and he'd often walk past sites where Polish people were executed during World War II. Pleasant. On top of that, he also discovered that apparently that forest was where a medieval queen from the 13th century had, gone into exile in order to escape an incoming invasion, hiding among the trees. And he thought, well, what kind of music would someone like that queen hear? And not like actual music, like the kind of stuff that fears in your mind would conjure up on their own. I think you're starting to figure out why the Halloween setup's here. So he went out to research the folk music of Ukraine and Poland and mutated that material to show something that would reflect psychological trauma. And the album cover plays into this too. Like Jansen said that he was struck by this photograph here and how it made the souls of the long departed feel a bit nearer, describing it as having a crystal clear but haunting atmosphere that fascinated him. Yes, this is the most outwardly spooky tale behind any Biosphere album, maybe even more so than Autour de la Lune. Every track on here is comprised of melted together snippets of Eastern European and Russian folk music. Every track on here is very light and airy, as usual, not a single beat to be found. And honestly, you could be forgiven for not being able to recognize the use of sampling at all on many of these tracks, on most of these tracks. Because all of the 17 pieces on this album are extremely formless. The samples seem to echo way off into the distance. There are a couple of moments where things get a little more Shinjo-esque and you can hear some orchestral snippets. But for the most part, it's very airy samples of choirs that are so modulated to the point of sounding like they're melding with the air around you. Like you're not even really sure whether there's even music there or if it's just the wind. Sounds pretty cool, right? As for my own feelings, though, I've had a hard time parsing them with this thing. I certainly don't think this album is even close to as bad as his last one. He did at least accomplish what he was going for on this one. The album is extremely subtle, extremely airy. Like, who would have guessed a Biosphere album is going for something subtle, right? He's never done that before. Here's the thing, though. I've listened to this album like 6 times in preparation for this review, and without exception, the entire project almost completely disappeared from my head once I was done listening to it. Like most of my listens to this thing, I would have a very hard time recalling the sound of any of these tracks specifically. And I know what the album generally sounds like as a whole, but I could not tell any of the 17 tracks apart at all. I had to actively try and sit up and pay close attention in order to describe any of these tracks outside of the original description I gave earlier, i.e. formless and ghostly samples of Eastern European folk music. Like, if I were to put the album on repeat, I don't think I would notice any tracks changing for several hours. And this thing's about 70 minutes total. Not exactly short, but not exactly eye-poppingly long either. There are a couple of moments that I might be able to gravitate towards. The most obvious one that stuck out to me was the track Aura in the Kitchen with Candlesticks. That one would stick out because it sounds exactly like a track from Shinjo. Like a seamlessly looped orchestral sample with a single guitar chord playing occasionally. It's still just as ghostly and unnerving as everything else around here, but it has a bit more warmth to it than anything else. It has a richer and more present bass, while most of the tracks that came before just kind of floated in the higher frequencies. Like, for instance, what sounds like solo flutes on the opener, Out of the Cradle, or the non-melodic fragment Down on Ropes. There are other tracks before that might stick out to me a bit. Like the track Sweet Dreams Form a Shade had all these choirs that called to mind the Bent track A Ribbon for My Hair, and the track Wyll and Purpose had some dark pads that actually kind of reminded me of my own track Condition Check. I'm not accusing him of using the same loops that I did. It's just like a similar vibe, but you know, it's just surface level comparison there that came to mind. And there were tracks after or in the kitchen with Candlesticks that stuck out to me in various ways. Basically, if it had bass, it got my thumbs up. Take the title track, much less well-formed than Or in the Kitchen, but its repetitive loop of ghostly choirs and bassy washes made me go, yeah, I can count this as a favorite when I was directly looking at the track listing. Same with a bunch of these tracks near the end, like You Wanna See It Too, Good Case and Rest, The Closer, Fall Asleep for me. Very similar blend on all of those, albeit the latter's, again, more treble, but I also like the penultimate track with precious benefits to both. Some very distant perfect fifth harmonies, resulting in maybe a little bit of a major key vibe that felt like it was lifting some of the tension off and feeling more refreshing. But another earlier track with more major key harmonies, Invariable Cowhandler, that didn't make me feel better in the same way. Mainly because, again, it had no bass. And then, of course, not including all the tracks where the samples are so modulated that melodies or chords become very difficult to recognize. That's pretty much all the tracks I haven't already mentioned. I suppose, like, tracks like Whole Forests of Them Appearing can use it to their advantage. Though, again, there are a lot of treble-heavy tracks that leave less of an impression. I wrote down Behind the Stove as the least favorite, because that's the only track that doesn't break 2 minutes. And again, it's all treble, and there's plenty of tracks that sound just like it. Just decided to pick on that one because it was short, I guess. But yeah, it took a very attentive listen in order to write down these descriptions of tracks. As a whole, I'm not sure whether or not I prefer this over Autour de la Lune. I think this is a little better, given how this feels a lot less basic in its construction and only gives off the feel of empty space compared to Autour's much emptier spaces. But Autour had much more of a structure. Each of the 9 tracks had an identity and I could tell them all apart. So long as I had headphones that could pick up the bass frequencies at least. This album I tend to get completely lost in and not be able to tell where I am in the album at any given point. Or in the Kitchen with Candlesticks is the one point I suppose I can recognize after enough listens. Like a warm cabin in the middle of the forest, while all the other tracks are just various parts of the forest that all look generally the same, and you'll get a lot of deja vu when you go through this thing. And once again, I get the feeling this is the entire point. An album like this does kind of make me miss Autour and being able to tell tracks apart from each other and know where in the album I am. But with 17 tracks on this one and all of them being pretty much structurally identical, that it's so easy to not be able to tell where you are, that seems specifically by design. And you can see how that would fit in with the concept of the album being about this queen from centuries past, living alone in the forest and on the run from a hostile invasion. But, whatever. At the end of the day, Departed Glories is a pretty cool album, but it's not one of the strongest moments in the entire Biosphere catalog. Whenever I listen to this, it feels like I don't really have a lot to latch on to, and despite the constant haunting, ghostly presence throughout everything and extremely isolated feel that is executed very well, it's the kind of album that is at best mood music for when no one is around, and if you're not in that environment, it's just kind of a nothing album that doesn't do anything to grab my attention or stick in my mind as memorable. It kind of reads to me as a much less tangible companion to Shenzhou, and unsurprisingly I far prefer that album as it's much more enveloping and emotionally affecting. I do think this is the kind of album that got better once I actually got the words down to describe it. I think there is an experience to get out of this album that you can't get elsewhere, and if it really clicks for you and you have the time to get it in the right mood and atmosphere to really let it settle, then all the more power to you. I think it can work in that way. I'm just not sure if it has enough for me to keep around, though. Like, it's probably gonna get cleared off my iPod once I'm done with this series, and I'll just forget about it disappearing into the ether, just like all the departed souls it was to channel. I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time. Almost completely disappeared from my head once I was done listening to it. Thanks for waiting until I was done with the sentence.